Welcome back to It's Not Normal, the podcast, episode 39. In this week's episode, I want to talk about self-doubt and toxic productivity. Self-doubt is something that I think everyone experiences, regardless of whether or not you were raised in a traumatic environment. I think that self-doubt, in some ways, is a positive thing. I think it's important for us as human beings to question ourselves, to check in with ourselves, to kind of imagine the opposite perspective, and to make sure that what we're doing is in fact the right thing, that it's helping us to get to where we want to be. And I think sometimes that can be rooted in a little bit of self-doubt, in questioning yourself, your intentions, your actions, your reactions, all of that. I think it's tied into self-awareness to a certain degree. And if you're aware of it and you don't allow it to dictate your emotions or actions or reactions, that I think is when we can utilize self-doubt in a positive and healthy way in our lives. That being said, for those of us who were raised in unhealthy environments, I think self-doubt has a really interesting way of manifesting itself in a lot of different aspects of our lives. The first thing that I want to talk about is sort of this idea that for most of my life, I felt like I was self-aware only in the ways that my words, actions, behaviors affected others. And I think that was largely due to the fact that I was viewing myself through the lens of other people. I think the way that I felt about myself was largely dependent on how the people around me felt about me. And I think that's exactly the point when you're dealing with a narcissistic or an emotionally immature parent. I think a lot of their power and control is rooted in their ability to make you feel a certain way about yourself, about your behavior, based solely on how it makes them feel. And so I don't think for a long time that I had developed any sort of personal self-awareness where I would say something or do something or share an opinion or a story and ask myself, how did that make me feel? I think I was always approaching it from the perspective of how is what I'm going to say or what I'm going to do going to make this other person feel? Is it going to be a positive reaction or a negative reaction? And I think more often than not, I based a lot of my decisions off of those answers rather than true self-awareness and sort of turning those questions inward and asking myself those questions and basing my decisions off of my personal answers. And it can be really difficult, I think, to separate yourself from other people's perceptions of you when you're raised in a toxic environment. Because so many of us, I think, grow up viewing ourselves as an extension of our parent. We're kind of living our life in service to them. And so if the people that we are living our life in service towards are not happy with us, they're not happy with our performance or how we're showing up, I think so often that translates to us feeling badly about ourselves, like we are not enough. We should try harder. We should do something different. And it can be really challenging as you start to realize your trauma and move into adulthood to start viewing yourself as an individual and to no longer allow other people's perceptions of you to define who you are or to dictate how you feel about yourself. And again, I do think it's important when we're talking about self-awareness to allow other people's emotions and feelings and experiences to have a say. If we're dealing with a partner or a friend or a family member who we've maintained a healthy relationship with, who care about us, who we care about, I think being open to constructive criticism or hearing someone out if something that you said or did was hurtful to them, I think that that is really important. But where it gets difficult, I think, for a lot of us who were raised in these kinds of environments is that the things that a narcissistic or an emotionally immature parent will expect us to do are unhealthy or abnormal. They are self-sacrificing in a lot of ways. And so our gauge for what we should be doing versus what we shouldn't be doing is sort of skewed. We were never taught where to draw that line in a healthy way between how we should show up for ourselves and how we should be showing up for other people. In last week's episode, we talked about friendship and what that means, what that looks like for a lot of us who were raised in these toxic environments. And piggybacking off of that episode, I think a lot of self-doubt can be rooted in childhood. It can be rooted in isolation and ostracism that we experience throughout our developmental sort of formative years. And this isolation and ostracism, I think, so often can be a direct result of narcissistic behaviors and tendencies. For me, it always felt like my parents sort of wanted me to feel like I was misunderstood, like I was an outcast, and the resulting isolation eventually led me to turning a lot of that focus inward and asking myself, what's wrong with me? I felt like there was a problem with me. There was something wrong with me that was the cause of me not fitting in. And so I think the first way that self-doubt can kind of manifest itself in our lives when we're raised by an emotionally immature parent is through isolation and ostracism with our peers, not feeling that sense of community or camaraderie, and as a result, feeling like there's something wrong with us, like we are the root of this problem and we are the cause of our lack of friendships and socialization. What makes this that much more challenging is that this isolation can sometimes be reinforced at home. And I think, if you're dealing with a more challenging time in school, typically going home to your immediate family, to your parents, should be the place that you can rest and relax and recuperate and kind of get that reassurance that you might not be getting elsewhere. But when we're dealing with parents like this, it's the opposite. You're being exposed to gaslighting, stonewalling, and as you get older, smear campaigns. Gaslighting is meant to make you doubt your perception of reality, your recollection of events, your ability to recall different memories. And it's such a debilitating manipulative tactic, I think, that is used by narcissistic parents deliberately that creates a lot of self-doubt on a very foundational level. Because now you're not just doubting how you show up in different social interactions. They're not just these passing conversations. These are very substantial things that you are being prompted to doubt within yourself, like the way that you experience the world around you, the way that you interpret things. It can be something like asking your parent to go out with a friend, and you make a plan. You agree to a plan, a certain day at a certain time. Maybe from the time that you've had that conversation to the time that you're actually supposed to go and see this friend, something has happened, your parent has changed their mind, and now they will do everything in their power to try to get you to doubt that that interaction ever happened. You never had that conversation. You never told me you were going out at that time. Why would I have planned this thing on this day if I knew that you were doing this? That didn't happen. And so, especially throughout childhood, I think, when you are sort of hardwired to rely on your parents for reassurance and guidance, it can be so disorienting to feel that certainty sort of morph into uncertainty. And it's inevitable that those feelings will kind of bleed into other aspects of your life. And it'll make it that much easier for your parent to control you and to manipulate the way that you think and remember things. So you've got gaslighting, which I think is a huge contributor to self-doubt in children of emotionally immature parents. And in an instance like we were just talking about, let's say you follow through with that plan and you go and see that friend. On the surface, going to see a friend, there's nothing wrong with that. You should never feel compelled to apologize for that. You're not doing anything wrong by wanting to have a friend and maintain a friendship. But to a narcissistic parent, that can be viewed as threatening. And so they might do a number of things to try to dissuade you from doing that in the future. And one of those things is stonewalling, the silent treatment. This is something that I have personal experience with, and it took me a long time to understand how destructive this behavior is. And I think this is one of those tactics that I look at and I imagine myself in the position of a parent. I imagine a child coming to me asking for forgiveness, upset, crying, for doing something that in truth they shouldn't even be apologizing for, and having it in me to just completely ignore them, to withdraw any and all attention, affection, support, you name it, I'm not giving it. It's terrible to even imagine. And yet so many of us experienced that throughout childhood and became accustomed to expect that kind of behavior. It sort of became our normal. That, I think, is another major contributing factor to self-doubt, because maybe you're doing something that on the surface is objectively normal. Personally, it's very positive for you, but the result is the complete withdrawal of all attention and affection and support from your parent, from your primary support system. And so what kind of message does that send to you as a child? That you doing things that are normal and positive, that are fulfilling to you, might result in your parent not speaking to you and pretending as if you're not even in the room anymore, and nothing that you do can change that. It leaves you feeling so powerless and so confused as to what you should or shouldn't do moving forward. And then, of course, we've got smear campaigns. And this is something that you may not experience until you get a bit older, until you start to realize your trauma and take steps to remove yourself from this unhealthy environment or to distance yourself from this toxic person. This is also something that I've got personal experience with. And talk about self-doubt. The goal of a smear campaign for a narcissistic parent is to get you to doubt your decisions, to question whether or not you're doing the right thing, and ultimately to go back to the way that things were, to once again be obedient and compliant, and to neglect yourself, to once again allow yourself to be emotionally abused and manipulated. You're allowing them to regain control. I think that is what they want when they set out on this smear campaign. And as someone who grew up craving and valuing so highly the approval of my parents, I always felt like if I were to do something in school and I got in trouble by the teacher, but then when I went home and told my parents, if they said, listen, it's okay, you did the right thing, then I wasn't really in trouble. That was kind of the mentality that I grew up with. And so to have that approval not only taken away, but for there to also be an active effort by these same people to completely deconstruct and tear down the decisions that I was making, that in my life in the present were making my life so much better. I was distancing myself from people who were emotionally manipulating me. I was removing myself from an unhealthy environment. I was finally allowing myself the space to develop my individuality, to exercise my independence, and to get to know myself for the first time outside of any sort of expectations. All of these things were so crucial and fulfilling for me as a young adult. And yet, the more that I did those things, the more I was made to feel like a bad person. I remember at one point, my parents sent me a photo of myself from the summer before I had moved out. And along with that was a long message along the lines of, where did she go? You're not the same person anymore. I miss her. To do that to someone who you're supposed to love and care about, I think is bizarre. But for me, it was a really strange experience, because I still felt like the same person. I still felt like I had always been me, truly deep down. But I think my behaviors on the surface were just dictated by my environment. They were dictated by other people's perceptions of me and how I thought my words and actions would affect other people. I would act accordingly. That was what I was conditioned to do throughout my childhood. And the only difference now was that I was basing my behavior off of myself and how I felt about myself. And that no longer aligned with what my parent wanted, with what they expected of me, because it didn't allow them to maintain control over me in the way that they had for the majority of my life. And that was threatening to them. That made them uncomfortable. And so they would continually try to guilt trip me into reverting back to a past version of myself that was much easier to manipulate and control. And navigating that time in my life was so challenging. To start to build a new life, which requires the deconstruction of your old life, while also being pressured, compelled to return to your past life by the people who, for most of your life, you craved their approval more than anything else. I don't know if there's ever been more of a tug of war mentally, I think, for me, or emotionally, I should say, because the more I learned and the more perspective I gained, the easier it was for me mentally to sort of detach and to focus on myself. But I think on an emotional level, it definitely was a challenge, because it sort of felt like these two things couldn't coexist. And that was really upsetting to me, to feel like I could no longer have a relationship with my parents and also live a life that was positive and healthy and sustainable for me personally. And so smear campaigns, I think, can really reinforce a lot of self-doubt that had already sort of been planted throughout our childhood. And what's so important, I think, about reflecting on these different times in our life, these different experiences, is that we can start to understand where a lot of these feelings come from and how they've impacted us throughout our lives, and use that information to create a path forward for us that allows us to live a life that we want to live and to navigate these more challenging emotions or experiences. Because I think when you're raised in that kind of environment, you lack emotional intelligence. You lack self-awareness. You don't develop those things at an early age. And so you're kind of playing catch up. And instead of having that foundation, instead you've sort of developed these coping mechanisms, these trauma responses that make sometimes even just daily interactions or experiences that much more difficult to navigate, because you're not acting from a place of self-awareness or understanding. You're acting from a place of trauma. Maybe you're stuck in fight, flight, freeze, fawn. And I think understanding these things allows us to start to take steps to regulate our nervous system and, in turn, our responses. Something else that I wanted to touch on in this week's episode is social media. And social media as a whole, I think, is a large contributor to self-doubt, especially amongst young people, teens, people in their early 20s. I think having everyone's life on display, in your face, at your fingertips, leads to a lot of comparison. And something that I've heard a lot, as I'm sure a lot of you have, is that comparison is the thief of joy. And so when you see other people's lives and the things that they're doing, the highlights of their life, it can be so easy to kind of sit back and compare what it appears that they're doing to what you're actually doing, and to feel like maybe you're not doing enough or like you should be doing something else. I think it's so important to recognize that social media is a highlight reel. It's only a snippet, a little peek into what's actually going on behind the scenes, and to take the things that we see with a grain of salt. But I think for everyone who is on social media sharing their stories about enduring trauma, about being raised by a narcissistic parent, and the resulting challenges, social media can be a very scary place, because you're opening yourself up to an infinite audience, and you're sharing some of the most vulnerable aspects of your life. And unfortunately, I think with social media, there are people who are going to come across things, who are going to feel compelled to be rude and unkind. I've gotten some incredibly hurtful comments from people who know nothing about my life, who say things as if they've known my parents forever, as if they understand the relationship dynamic between myself and my parents. I can go on, but there's no reason to focus time and energy on so much negativity, because the same thing that we learn when we're dealing with parents like this is that there's no sense in reasoning with someone who is committed to misunderstanding you. And yet, I have to admit that these comments make their way into my thought process and feed into that deeply rooted self-doubt. Because I start to question sometimes, why am I doing this? Was it really that bad? Are all of these things that I'm talking about valid? And granted, every time these intrusive thoughts make their way into my brain, I'm able to recognize them and see them for what they are because I have an understanding of intrusive thoughts, and to let them go. But it doesn't change the hurt that you feel on the surface when you encounter something like this. But it sort of reinforces this idea that it's so important to live your life and to base your actions on your own perception of yourself, and not to allow the way that other people feel about you to dictate how you feel about yourself. Because, when I encounter comments like this or messages like this from people who maybe have been lucky enough in their life to never experience emotional abuse or manipulation or any sort of trauma resulting from a relationship with a narcissist. Because those people, I think, when you say certain things to someone who has never experienced this, it can be hard to even imagine. It can be hard to believe that these things are even true. And I think sometimes these people fail to realize how lucky they are for these things to have never even crossed their mind, so much so that they doubt their existence. But when I encounter comments like this, I think sometimes it distances me a bit from why I started sharing my experience in the first place. And I have to sometimes make a conscious effort to remind myself of the value in authenticity and the strength in vulnerability. And, I was reading this book, Maisie Hill. She sent me her new book, Powerful. And I was looking through the chapters, and there was a chapter on people pleasing. And so naturally, I went straight to that and dove in. And within a few pages, she started talking about fawning as a trauma response, and how people pleasing is rooted in hypervigilance, and how all of these things stem from being raised in an environment where you felt like your well-being was dependent upon the mood of another person. And that really connected some dots for me that I think I will be able to pull on in these moments of self-doubt. Because before I moved out, before I knew anything about mental health, throughout my childhood and my teens, I remember feeling and vocalizing that my parents' mood dictated the mood of the entire house. I understood that. I experienced that. But I had no idea about where that was coming from. I had no idea that my parent displayed these narcissistic tendencies, and that is why their mood governed the house. I had no idea that I was fawning so that I could be on the good side of my parent because I viewed them as a threat. And so rather than challenging them, I'm going to get on the good side of this threat out of self-protection. I had no idea that me feeling compelled to never say no to anyone, to any request, was me being a people pleaser, and that my people pleaser was rooted in hypervigilance, this constant need to be aware, always putting someone else first and trying to anticipate how other people are feeling. And understanding all of that, being able to put words to this experience, was transformative for me. And that is why I think it's so important to talk openly and honestly about our experiences, and to create a space where we're safe to be vulnerable, because we can learn so much from each other. And through that, we can learn so much about ourselves that allow us to live a life that is much more sustainable and much more fulfilling. And so in this book, in this chapter, Maisie Hill was kind of talking about the idea of toxic productivity. And this, I think, is mainly for my US audience because, I've only ever spoken on my personal experience, and I was born and raised in the States, and this is sort of the only culture that I know. I think hustle culture is so prevalent here. I think this capitalist ideology, this toxic productivity sort of feeds this narrative that we should be doing more so that we can get more. We should be more. And if you're not doing more, then there's someone out there that is. And so in some way you're falling short or you're less than. There's this constant pressure to be productive. And for those of us who were raised feeling like our self-worth, our value as a person was rooted more so in what we did rather than who we were, I think the addition of hustle culture, toxic productivity, can really intensify these feelings of not being enough, not doing enough, not showing up as often, not constantly being on. And she started talking about how self-awareness challenges the toxic productivity narrative, and it allows us to act from a place of self-acceptance and to just be, instead of feeling like we constantly have to be on, like we always have to be doing more so that we can get more. We can just be. And how that is so much more transformative than this never-ending race. And this really resonated with me because between my childhood and my academic experience and being raised in this culture, I have at times found it really challenging to allow myself to enjoy where I am because I haven't gotten to where I want to be yet, especially if the thing that I am doing isn't directly getting me closer to that goal of mine. It doesn't allow me to be present or to be mindful because my mind is constantly existing in the future. And it was only recently, I would say, within the last few months that I've been able to start to overcome that personal challenge of mine, because I used to look at my days as sort of a checklist, as an individual entity where I woke up and I had a plan for the day, and the number of boxes that I checked off of my mental to-do list would sort of dictate how I felt about the day. But I've recently been able to kind of switch my view and no longer look at my days as individual days, but rather as a continuation where each day leads into the next, and all of my days together are what create my life. I was actually talking to my little sister about this a few days ago, and she said, it's a bedtime, not a deadline. And I thought that was so clever and so real, because I used to view the end of my day more like a deadline. Like, have I gotten everything that I need to get done today done? And if not, when will I do that? I had to have a plan so that I could feel okay about it. But now, I understand that if I don't, first, I've started to shorten my mental to-do lists, because I was one of those people that would overload my day to the point that it was almost impossible for me to get everything done, which would always lead me to feeling like I didn't do enough. So a practice of mine has been limiting my tasks throughout the day to something that is much more realistic, so that I'm not continually setting myself up for disappointment. But now, even if I don't get everything done, I understand that tomorrow is another day, and that I don't have to allow the number of things that I did throughout my day to dictate whether or not that was a positive or a negative experience. Was it a good day or a bad day? Because sometimes things come up. That is life. I think life, the nature of it, is unpredictable. And our ability to change and adapt, and also to welcome spontaneity, I think sometimes can really help us in navigating life. Because sometimes the things that you do outside of what might seem directly productive are indirectly productive. The things that you do purely for fun and enjoyment, the time that you spend outside of work, might lead you to developing some perspective or allowing space for some creative thought that can then feed into your work in a really positive way. I think rest, it's the same thing with rest and recuperation. It is not a reward, it is necessary. It is productive in and of itself. And I think the self-doubt that is a result of hustle culture and toxic productivity will tell you otherwise. It will convince you otherwise. For the longest time, I felt guilty anytime I had downtime. I felt like I should be doing more. Not only does that lead to burnout, but I think it allows you to start to take steps to live a much more balanced life. Once I started to realize that rest is productive, that aspects of my life outside of the directly, obviously productive aspects of my life that might be getting me closer to the place that I want to be, once I started to realize that the aspects of my life outside of just that also contribute to me reaching and achieving those goals, that was when my mindset was finally able to switch. And I started to realize that I will achieve my goals in time, and I will do it in a much more sustainable, in a much happier way if I'm living a balanced life. I may not even reach my goals as quickly if I neglect those other sides of myself, because I will be burnt out. And then what's going to happen when I get there? If I get there, I think we're always going to be improving. We're always going to want to do more. There isn't really an end goal or a finish line that I think so many of us can sometimes imagine, even those of us who carry with us this false sense of urgency. It's always like we're working to get to a certain point where we believe that we're going to have more time. And so imagine neglecting all of these other parts of yourself because you've been conditioned to do so, because you doubt yourself and what feels true and positive to you, because you're living your life based on other people's standards and expectations. You get to this place, but you're exhausted. But you haven't done the things that you wanted to do, that you said you were going to do outside of this, because all of your time and energy has been consumed by this one thing. I don't think it's positive to live such an unbalanced life. And yet I think for so many of us who were raised by emotionally immature parents, our lives were incredibly unbalanced for such a long time that it can be not only difficult to regain any sense of balance, but also to not doubt ourselves in the pursuit of that balance, because we feel like completely neglecting ourselves and pouring all of our time and energy into what is expected of us, into what's going to make our parents happy, our friends happy, our bosses happy, is the right thing to do, can be so challenging. It can feel sort of like the opposite of everything that we've ever been taught or told. And yet there's so much truth in that. I think there's so much power in self-awareness and self-acceptance, allowing ourselves to act from a place of self-acceptance so that we can allow ourselves to do the things that are important to us, that make us feel good, that will eventually help us to get to the place that we want to be, all the while we don't have to neglect these other parts of ourselves that are just as important as the objectively productive ones. We represent a much bigger picture. I think there are so many different parts of every single one of us, and we should never feel compelled to neglect those parts, especially if the reason for neglecting them is that they don't serve other people better. With that, I think I'm going to be wrapping up this week's episode. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. We are almost at 2,000 subscribers, which is super exciting. And if you're listening on Spotify, please be sure to leave us a rating. I will be back next week with another episode of It's Not Normal, the podcast.